Hey guys, back with another video, and today we're talking about training volume. More specifically, we're talking about how more volume isn't always better. On the topic of training volume, a lot of people out there are, I would say, a little bit confused as far as what the research says about training volume. Most people read research articles or even articles that are written by other people who have read the research, and they think that what the research says is that more volume always equates to more gains, more strength, more hypertrophy, things like that. When in reality, that's kind of too simplistic. It's getting a little bit too simple with what the research actually says. Now, let me explain up front how people get that. So in the research, if you expose two people or two groups of people to two different amounts of training volume and hold all other variables the same as far as exercise selection, things like that, we find that the group that has more training volume in their training program will usually end up gaining more strength or gaining more muscle mass over the course of the training program. So people see that, and that's been echoed time and time again. Pretty much any research article that or research study that has been done with training volume being manipulated like that will show that more volume equals more gains. So with that, people started to think, hey, more volume is always better. The research shows if you go on a program that has more training volume, you're going to get more gains. So as a result, people have extrapolated that to say that over time, you need to keep increasing volume over and over and over again, or else you're not going to be able to progress. You're not going to get more gains. And so the thought is that the more advanced you are in your training career, the higher volume your program should be if you want to keep seeing gains. Unfortunately, that's not really true. That is kind of a logical fallacy, so to speak. That's taking the data, that's taking the research that says one thing and extrapolating it out to something that's actually completely different. So there's actually sort of a threshold when it comes to training volume. There is a point at which training volume, if you keep increasing training volume, it's not going to benefit you anymore. So there was actually a study done on German volume training, which is a very famous way of training that has been that was come up with as far as promoting hypertrophy, where you're doing 10 sets of 10 repetitions of each different exercise. So say bench press or overhead press or squats, so on and so forth. And so 10 by 10 was like this gold standard, so to speak, of hypertrophy for a long time. Well, they did a study where they compared basically one group did half the volume by doing only 5 sets of 10, and the other group did the traditional 10 sets of 10. And what they found was that those who did 5 sets of 10 actually got more hypertrophy and more strength gains compared to the group who was in the 10 sets of 10. So even though their volume was 50% less, they got better results at the end of the study. So that kind of goes against that whole more volume is always better. That kind of goes to show that there is a threshold somewhere between that 5 to 10 sets of 10. You're getting this drop off and perhaps even a regression of the of your ability to get gains from that program. And so to illustrate that a little bit better, I'd like to show you guys a little bit graph. So let's go to the whiteboard, shall we? So here we have what most people think happens. Over time, as volume goes up, our ability to recover from that also goes up, and therefore we get an increase in gains, which is basically unlimited. So this is not right. This is actually incorrect. This is not what happens over time. What actually does happen, and this was what was shown at least a little bit illuminated with that training study I just alluded to, is something more like this. So as you keep increasing training volume, and as that time goes on and volume keeps going up, your ability to recover actually reaches a plateau, and it actually starts going back down. And as a result, you see that the gains, although they initially do go up as volume goes up, they plateau as well, and then you get a sharp decline. And if I were to keep drawing this graph out for you guys, I would actually show that volume is going to eventually plummet. Why is that the case? Well, if you keep increasing training volume and you never deload or you never change your program, what's going to happen is you're going to get injured. So then that graph is going to look even worse because volume will go way down. Gains will actually go down to a level that's lower than where you started, and now you're in a worse place as a result. So the big thing here is that your ability to recover from a training program is what's ultimately going to dictate how much volume you should be doing. And the amount of volume you should be doing is very individual. Some people can recover from more volume than others just naturally, and some people can recover from more volume than others because of lifestyle circumstances or stressors that are going on in their life. So, two people who have the same base ability to recover from exercise, from genetically speaking, might have two different jobs, two different family structures, two different lifestyles, and so the one who has a harder life or more stress in their life is going to be able to recover from a lot less than the person who has more of a carefree life, who doesn't have as much stress. So what does this all mean necessarily in the context of volume? As you get more advanced in your training career, you actually might need less volume. I'll say that again. You might need less volume than you did early on in your career in order to keep seeing progress, in order to keep seeing gains. Why might that be the case? Well, let's take a look at what your training looks like in year 10 versus what your training looked like in year 5 or even year 1 or 2 when you were beginning. When you were first starting out, chances are you weren't as strong as you were in year 5 and definitely not as strong as you are in year 10. So let's compare, say, back squats, 3 sets of 5 at 225 pounds versus 3 sets of 5 at 405 pounds. Which one of those do you think is going to cause more stress on your body and cause more of a training impulse on your body? Well, definitely the 3 sets of 5 at 405, right? Because now you're using heavier weight, and although those two efforts, maybe 405 seems like the same as 225 felt when you were early on in your training career, it doesn't feel the same to your central nervous system. The reason being, and we can get into some real specifics here around how strength or the neuromuscular system, I should say, but the way I like to describe it is, as you get stronger, you kind of always had the ability to produce that strength, but what happens is as you train, your brain or your nervous system kind of it raises the limit as to how much it will allow your muscles to handle. And so at 405, now its limit is much higher, so you're actually kind of digging a little bit deeper into your nervous system physiology to squat that 405 as you were when it was 225. So all that to kind of say that as you get farther and farther along in your training career, you are producing more and more stress, more and more impulse, more and more, we'll just call it impulse on the nervous system, on the training itself, and that's going to need more recovery and more time to recover between those sessions as compared to when you were younger and you had a less training impulse and you were using much lighter weights and much less complex movements. So that's kind of why you might actually need less volume over time with respect to your training volume. Now, you kind of want to make sure that you're staying in a sweet spot. And I mentioned earlier that everybody has a different training volume that they're going to adapt to, but there's going to be a sweet spot for you where you kind of want to stick in there most of the time. I know that some people advocate like 12 to 20 sets per session. Some people advocate a little bit more, even a little bit less. I would say anywhere from 10 to 30 sets per session, depending on where you're at in your training program right now, is pretty good. So if you added up all the sets that you do for all of the exercises in a training session, if you're within that 10 to 30 mark most of the time, you're probably doing pretty good. Now, you might go to 30 or maybe even just slightly above 30 on times where you're really trying to dig deep and kind of get that super compensation, trying to push yourself a little bit beyond your limits. But most of the time, you're probably going to stick under 30. You're going to stick more in that 20, 25, 15 to 25 range. And that's going to be pretty solid that's going to be a solid training session. As long as you're pushing the weights week to week, as long as you're putting in a good effort and you're sticking to good RPEs, and not every single set is a 10 out of 10 RPE, you're going to be fine there. Now, the important thing is that you're going to have to continue progressive overload, even if the volume seems to stay somewhat the same over time. And what I mean by that is we all know like the famous illustration of the Herculean guy who's lifting the calf over his shoulder and going up the hill, and then over time that calf grows up and becomes a bull, and the guy gets stronger as a result because over time he's lifting more and more weight. But the interesting thing is that nowhere in that picture does it say that you need that guy took that bull versus the calf and went up 10 times more than he did when it was just a calf, right? He's just going up the hill one time with the calf, and then as it grows, he's getting stronger, his muscles are growing, things like that. So the same thing can be applied here, right? So if you're doing 3 sets of 5 as a beginner, you can still do 3 sets of 5 as a more advanced athlete. You're just going to be using more weight, and as a result, that's going to equate to more volume. It's not going to be this crazy thing where you started at 3 sets of 5, now you're doing 20 sets of 5 with 405. You're just still doing that 3 sets of 5. You don't need to keep increasing your sets or your reps over time necessarily. But you have to continue progressing either your weight or your movement difficulty or something else in your training that's allowing you to adapt to that stimulus. So for most people, they want to see the weight go up on the bar. It might be as simple as moving from a leg press to a hack squat and then to a back squat, or it might be as simple as going from a dumbbell RDL to a barbell RDL to a trap bar deadlift to a sumo deadlift. The complexity of that movement is getting harder and harder over time, and you're likely also going to be lifting more weight over time with some of those exercises, but that's not always the case. But that complexity is also going to allow you to build more muscle, build more strength over time. So taking it all home, essentially within a training block, it is true that you kind of want to increase volume over time a little bit. Let's say within a 3-month period, you at some point are going to have increases in volume, hopefully a deload, start at a lower volume again, and you're kind of having this undulating thing with your volume. But at a certain point, you're going to have to kind of hit the reset button on everything and go back to a lower volume approach and reset your training, the weights you're using in training to be maybe a little bit heavier, or the complexity of your movements to be a little bit heavier. Over time, over a training career, your volume, as far as the number of sets and reps you do per session, doesn't necessarily need to change that much. Maybe there's a slight increase as you're getting into your intermediate phases of your lifting career, but then as you get more advanced, because you're using more of your strength reserve and you're getting more training impulse because you're using heavier weights, you might actually have to go back down with your training volume in order to keep seeing results. Why? Because recovery is ultimately the deciding factor here. You can only adapt if you're able to recover. So that's why you can't just do 20 sets of 10 reps or 50 sets in a session, because you're not going to be able to recover that day after day after day. You may be able to do that for a session or two to really drive the hammer home at the end of a training block, but that's going to be short-lived. You're going to have to go back to a more realistic training volume, and you're probably going to have to deload after something like that. So as far as training volume is concerned, yes, if you compare two training programs that are equated in everything except for training volume, more often than not, the training program with higher volume is going to be better as far as adaptations are concerned, but there's a limit. If this one has way too much training volume, you're probably going to see better results here. And this is something that I've seen with my clients, and I know a lot of coaches have seen with their clients, is that they come to them thinking, or with a training history, recent training history, where they're doing a ton of volume. They're doing 6 days a week of training, 30, 40, 50 sets per training session. And the first thing I do is bring them back down to a more realistic training program, maybe 3 to 5 days per week with 15 to 25 sets per session. And magically, they're gaining strength faster than ever. They're seeing hypertrophy gains faster than ever, and it's actually because now their body's actually able to recover from what they're doing, and they're not just running themselves into the ground all the time. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, give me a like, subscribe to me on YouTube, follow me on social media at Instagram at The Strength Cave, on Facebook at The Strength Cave 1, and let me know what you guys think. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.